So if you're planning to use extinction, there are several things you need to consider before you start an intervention. First of all, you do it after you've identified the function of a behavior. You know what the reinforcer is, and you've decided that it's something that you can withhold. You plan for it, and you anticipate that an extinction burst is going to occur. You know that part of an extinction burst might mean there's an escalation in the behavior. Plan for how you're going to handle those when they occur. Also, if you're going to ignore a behavior, do something while you're ignoring. That might mean you do something like self-monitoring your behavior, or have something you're going to do like give attention to other kids. Use extinction with procedures for increasing behavior. In other words, you don't use it by itself, but you do it in conjunction with something to increase an appropriate behavior or an alternative behavior. And you keep records of your of the student's behavior. You collect data so that you can evaluate if your intervention is working or having the effect that you want it to have. Let's talk about timeout. Timeout, again, really means timeout from positive reinforcement. It's different from extinction. With extinction, you're withholding a reinforcer for a specific behavior. It's possible to continue to interact with a student and reinforce a student for doing other things, but just not directly responding to a problem behavior. That's really what we do when we say we're redirecting a student. We sort of act as though one behavior isn't occurring. We prompt the student to do something else. When the student does that new behavior, then we reinforce them. Timeout is something different. With timeout, you stop reinforcement, and you do it contingent on some behavior. So it simply means that you're going to turn the reinforcement switch off for a student for a period of time. It's not the same thing as putting a kid in a corner or sending a kid into the hallway. There are three categories of timeout. The first one is called non-exclusionary timeout. It was actually the original form of timeout. The next category is called exclusionary. This is when you're actually going to keep the person in the instructional environment but exclude them from a specific activity. And then finally, isolation exclusion is the most restrictive form of timeout, and that involves putting someone in a timeout room. Non-exclusionary timeout is the very first form of timeout that was used. It was a study that was done in the 1960s, and it was called Evaluation of Timeout from Positive Reinforcement. In that study, they had some kindergarten-age kids. They all wore a ribbon. The teacher reinforced them with tokens for appropriate behavior. If a kid had a challenging behavior, the teacher simply took away one of the kid's ribbons. As long as that student was not wearing a ribbon, he or she was not able to earn tokens or reinforcement. The kid continued to sit there and be part of the instruction, but just wasn't earning reinforcement. And in that study, that was very effective in reducing the challenging behavior in these young kids. So that was a timeout ribbon program. It's been adapted over time. I've used different versions of it myself. Usually you have the student to wear something to indicate they're actually going to earn reinforcement. But you don't remove the student from the environment. You can do variations of this with a large group as well. You can have kids simply turn over a card on their desk, or the teacher would turn it over. And as long as the card's turned over, they're not earning reinforcers. Another form of timeout that is a little more restrictive but still very common is exclusionary timeout. With exclusionary timeout, you send the person away from the activity, but they're still in the classroom. Contingent observation is a very common form of exclusionary timeout. An example of this might be you're out on the playground with a group of kids. One student is not following the rules for the game or the sport that everyone's playing, and maybe is doing something that could be dangerous or hurt someone. So you warn that student to follow the rules. She doesn't listen to you, or he doesn't listen to you. So then you just say to them, okay, for the next 5 minutes, you're going to sit over here on the bench and you're going to watch everybody else play. And then the student sits there, and at the end of 5 minutes, you say, are you ready to follow the rules and rejoin the game? That is an example of contingent observation. You can do the same thing in the classroom. This would be you send the student to an area in the corner of the room. The student sits there, watches everybody else earning reinforcement, and then after a short period of time rejoins the group. This is probably the most common form of timeout that you see. What you should consider with it, though, is the function of the behavior. If the student is engaging in a behavior to escape a demand or an activity, then contingent observation could actually serve as a reinforcer for that student. So be very careful about that. It's interesting to me how people will continue to use something like contingent observation sometimes when the data shows that it has absolutely no effect on the behavior. Don't continue to use any intervention without changing it if it isn't working. Another form of non-exclusionary timeout that is a little controversial is something called movement suppression. This would be if you're working with a young child that is hitting or pinching, briefly holding the kid's hand for something like 5 seconds. I've used this with very young kids with severe disabilities because it was just a way of communicating to them that this was not an appropriate behavior. Be very careful if you use an intervention like this. Make sure that you have the necessary approvals because it could be considered a form of restraint, although it isn't quite the same thing as physical restraint. Isolation timeout is actually using a timeout room, and it is taking the person to another area that is ideally very sparse and has very little reinforcing properties to it. Be very careful about using isolation timeout because most of the incidents of physical aggression I see with a lot of kids is when they're being transported to a timeout area. It also is very hard not to attend to behavior that's involved with moving a kid to a timeout area. I view this more as an emergency kind of procedure. I don't believe isolation timeout is an effective way to change behavior. When I've been involved with it, it's been situations that we had a student who was so violent and so aggressive that he or she was likely to seriously hurt someone unless we removed that person from the environment with other kids. And we were relying on other interventions to actually change that person's behavior. Isolation timeout is a very restrictive procedure. Be sure that you are aware of and follow all the guidelines and policies for the program that you work with if you're going to use something like this. Also, be sure that this is not what you're relying on to change the person's behavior. This is not going to teach the person new skills. It is not going to give the person a better way to cope with difficult situations. And be very careful that it's not reinforcing the behavior. If you have behavior that is maintained by escape and avoidance, isolation timeout can reinforce that behavior. It could actually make the problem worse than making it better. There's a number of things you should consider when you're using timeout. First of all, and this is extremely important, timeout only works if you have time in. Time in is the amount of reinforcement the student can earn for appropriate behavior. I've seen people trying to implement timeout programs when there's not a lot of positive reinforcement for appropriate behavior. That doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So, first of all, do you have an environment that has very clear positive expectations and lots of reinforcement available for meeting those expectations? Also, do you have the ability to stop reinforcement contingent on some behavior? Be very careful about the fact that timeout could be a reinforcer for problem behavior. If you have escape motivated behavior, it could certainly reinforce it. Timeout is more effective for things like attention, because you are briefly withholding attention contingent on a behavior, or if there's some other form of reinforcement, like the student's not earning points or tokens.